What makes a legend endure? Is it the records sold, the money earned, or the awards polished on a shelf? Or is it something deeper? The way a voice can slice through time, binding strangers together in the shared ache of joy, heartbreak, and rebellion? Few artists have tested that question more fiercely than Rod Stewart. For over 6 decades, his gravel-soaked thunder has rattled arenas, seduced radios, and carved itself into the collective memory of entire generations. But his story is not one of smooth triumph. It is the story of survival. A man who has repeatedly stared into silence, whether from rejection, heartbreak, illness, or age, and refused to let it bury him. Rod Stewart is not just another rock icon. He is a survivor in the truest sense. This is the boy who once lowered coffins into the earth as a gravedigger in London, who failed at his first dream of professional football, who busked in street corners where no one cared if he sang or not. This is the man who, decades later, would sell out stadiums across continents, live like rock royalty, and yet privately weep over broken marriages, estranged children, and the haunting absence of a daughter given up for adoption. And this is also the man who, when cancer threatened to silence him forever, clawed back his voice note by note, whisper by whisper, until it roared again. The paradox of Rod Stewart's life is as dazzling as it is devastating, to millions. He is forever the sequined showman, grinning behind champagne glasses, hair like a golden lion's mane, strutting across stages with a charisma that seems untouchable. But beneath the glitter lies a far more human tale of fear, of fragility, of relentless attempts to balance the roar of fame with the fragile whispers of family. The truth is that Rod's greatest battles were never fought on stage. They were fought in hospital wards, courtrooms, and empty hotel rooms, where silence pressed harder than any critic's words. And yet, this is what makes his journey so uniquely compelling. Unlike many rock stars whose legacies are built on rebellion alone, Stewart's legacy is built on resilience. Every time life tried to erase him, he returned louder. Every time loss cut him down, he used it to sharpen his voice until it carried not just melody, but the raw confessions of a man who had lived through fire. That is why his music endures, because hidden in the rasp is not only rebellion, but survival. This video is not just about Rod Stewart's career highlights or his glamorous success. It's about the man who lived through the paradox of being adored by millions, yet haunted by loneliness. It's about the father who spent decades wrestling with guilt over broken families, even as his voice became the soundtrack to countless weddings and heartbreaks. It's about the patient survivor who faced cancer twice, stood at the edge of silence, and somehow returned to sing again. Along the way, we will walk through the peaks of his superstardom and the valleys of his private despair. We will revisit the nights when his roar drowned out stadiums, but also the quiet mornings when he wondered if his children would grow up without him. We will explore not just the image of Rod Stewart, but the fragile, resilient man who hides behind it. And we will ask the question that lingers in the twilight of his life. What keeps him singing? Is it love, survival, or the refusal to let silence win? This is the story of Rod Stewart, not just the rock star, but the survivor, the father, the patient, and the man who proved that even legends bleed. So, stay with us, because as you'll see, the real song of Rod Stewart's life was never just about music. It was about how to keep singing when the world tries to silence you. When Rod Stewart was busking on the damp streets of London in the early 1960s, the dream of becoming a professional musician still seemed almost absurd. London was a city brimming with sound. Every pub, every dance hall, every corner seemed to echo with guitars, harmonicas, and voices desperate to be heard. To stand out was like trying to catch lightning in a thunderstorm. And yet, somehow, Rod's rasp, raw, jagged, but undeniably human, had something different. It wasn't polished like the crooners of the day. It wasn't smooth like the Motown imports. It was scarred. It carried rejection, heartbreak, and defiance in every note. In 1963, fate cracked open its first door. Rod joined a small rhythm and blues group called the Dimensions. They weren't famous, barely scraping together gigs in smoky pubs where the smell of stale beer hung heavier than applause. But for Rod, each night was a proving ground. Every sway of strangers' bodies to his voice felt like a tiny victory over the invisibility that haunted him since football's rejection. He wasn't yet a star, but he was no longer a ghost either. Still, London was crowded with talent. Every night, another band was chasing the same dream. The Rolling Stones were cutting their teeth in clubs. The Yardbirds were electrifying audiences with wild guitar solos. It was an era of sonic revolution, and survival meant attaching yourself to people who could lift you higher. Rod knew this instinctively, and by 1967, at age 22, he caught his first real break, a chance to join the Jeff Beck Group. Jeff Beck was already a phenomenon, a guitar virtuoso who had made waves with the Yardbirds. To be in his band meant stepping out of the pubs and into stages where magazines took notes and record executives actually cared. For Rod, this was both salvation and humiliation. On one hand, he was no longer just Rod the Mod, hustling for coins. Now, he was performing with one of the greatest guitarists of his generation. On the other hand, he quickly discovered what it meant to live in someone else's shadow. Beck's solos were electric, dazzling, a force of nature. Critics raved about the guitarist's brilliance, while Rod's voice, though praised, was often treated as secondary. He became known not as Rod Stewart, but simply as Jeff Beck's singer. To a man who had already tasted the sting of rejection on the football pitch, this new kind of dismissal cut even deeper. He later admitted, with bitter honesty, "I was there, but I wasn't really there. I was a shadow in someone else's fire." That feeling of giving everything on stage, yet being overlooked, is one that resonates far beyond music. Many of us know what it's like to work hard, to pour our hearts into something, only to watch someone else get the spotlight. For Rod, every night on stage with Beck was both exhilarating and suffocating. He could feel the energy of the crowd, but it wasn't his. The applause bent toward the guitar solos, not the rasp that carried his soul. And yet, this humiliation became fuel. If football had taught him discipline and rejection had taught him resilience, Jeff Beck taught him ambition. Rod vowed that he would not spend his life remembered as somebody else's accessory. He wanted his name in lights, his story sung first, his identity carved into the roar of the crowd. That fire hardened him, gave his voice an edge sharper than before. By the late 1960s, he was beginning to find opportunities to step out from Beck's shadow. He briefly sang with the Faces, alongside Ronnie Wood, who would later join the Rolling Stones. With them, Rod discovered something he'd long craved: camaraderie. Faces wasn't just a band, it was brotherhood. Their chaotic energy, their booze-fueled performances, their infectious laughter gave Rod the feeling that he belonged, not just as a singer, but as a mate. But even there, tension brewed. Rod's growing solo ambitions, combined with the pressures of fame, would later fracture that unity. But in 1969, something monumental shifted. At just 24 years old, Rod released his first solo record, An Old Raincoat Won't Ever Let You Down. The album wasn't a chart explosion, but it was proof. Proof that he could stand alone, that his voice could carry his name without leaning on Jeff Beck's shadow. 2 years later, In 1971, the dam finally burst. Every Picture Tells a Story wasn't just a success, it detonated into the global consciousness. And at its heart was Maggie May, a song that captured all the ache of youth, the sting of regret, and the thrill of rebellion. Suddenly, the boy who once dug graves for strangers was being immortalized on the charts. For Rod, that moment was more than fame. It was vindication. No longer the failed footballer, no longer Jeff Beck's singer. He was Rod Stewart, a name now etched across both sides of the Atlantic. But here's the paradox. The very humiliation of being overshadowed had planted the seed of his greatest triumph. Without those years in Beck's shadow, without that gnawing ache of invisibility, perhaps Rod never would have developed the hunger that pushed him to carve out his own empire. Sometimes, being overlooked is the very thing that sharpens you. Sometimes, the fire you feel in someone else's spotlight is the spark that fuels your own. As the 1970s dawned, Rod Stewart was no longer a man in the shadows. He was stepping into the light, ready to roar on his own terms. But as we'll see, standing in the light brings its own kind of darkness. By the early 1970s, Rod Stewart had gone from busker to global name, from Jeff Beck's singer to a solo artist who could command the charts with his own voice. When Every Picture Tells a Story hit the world in 1971, with Maggie May blasting from radios across continents, it wasn't just a hit single, it was a cultural explosion. Here was a song that distilled everything Rod represented: mischief, rebellion, heartbreak, and a streak of vulnerability beneath the swagger. Almost overnight, Rod Stewart became not just a rising star, but a household name. The 1970s cemented that transformation. Tracks like You Wear It Well, Tonight's the Night, and later, Do You Think I'm Sexy, turned him into an international sensation. His records topped the charts in both the UK and the US, a rare feat in those days. Concerts swelled from smoky pubs to massive stadiums where thousands screamed his name. His trademark blonde mane, leopard print jackets, and raspy thunder of a voice created an image both rebellious and irresistible. He wasn't just another singer, he was a spectacle. And yet, that spectacle came at a cost. Fame is a strange kind of double-edged sword. It dazzles on the outside while cutting deep on the inside. For Rod, the 1970s and 1980s were years of glittering triumph, but also of growing fractures. One of the first casualties was Faces, the band of brothers who had given him camaraderie during the transition from Jeff Beck's shadow to solo stardom. As Rod's solo career skyrocketed, the balance within the band tilted. Critics accused him of abandoning the group, of chasing pop stardom while his mates stayed grounded in rock grit. The tensions simmered until they boiled over. Faces dissolved, leaving behind not only a professional split, but a personal wound. For Rod, it felt like betrayal on both sides. He later admitted he never wanted to lose them, but success has a cruel way of dividing people. Meanwhile, critics sharpened their knives. For every fan who adored his hits, there was a journalist ready to sneer. His move toward flashy pop anthems and disco-influenced tracks, especially Do You Think I'm Sexy, led to accusations that he had sold out. Here, the man who once howled for survival on London streets was now being caricatured as champagne excess, a leopard print peacock who cared more for spectacle than soul. To the tabloids, he wasn't Rod Stewart the artist, he was Rod the Mod, a playboy drenched in excess. That criticism stung deeper than most people realized. For a man who had fought so hard to be recognized, who had once been invisible even while standing on Jeff Beck's stage, the idea that people still weren't seeing the real him was agonizing. Outwardly, he leaned into the image. He partied, strutted, posed for cameras, and played the role of the untouchable showman. But behind closed doors, the silence after the applause was deafening. Loneliness is one of fame's cruelest companions. Dressing rooms that echoed with laughter during the climb to stardom now sat quiet after sold-out shows. The larger the crowd, the emptier the solitude afterward seemed. Rod himself would later admit that the summit of success was often the coldest place of all. He had the records, the money, the attention of millions. But in the quiet moments, he was still the boy from Highgate who longed for belonging. This paradox gave his music a dual quality. To the world, the songs were catchy, rebellious, seductive. But if you listened closely to his voice, hidden in the gravel was something else: sorrow. You could hear the ache of someone who knew the loneliness of rejection, who carried wounds that fame couldn't heal. Songs like "You're in My Heart" weren't just love ballads. They were confessions. Fragments of a man still searching for something deeper than stadium lights could provide. It's easy, from the outside, to assume superstars live untouchable lives of bliss. Rod Stewart's story proves otherwise. Fame can fracture friendships, magnify insecurities, and isolate even the most adored. His rise to superstardom made him immortal in the eyes of fans, but it also locked him into an image he sometimes felt powerless to escape. And yet, in true Rod Stewart fashion, he turned even this pain into power. The more critics mocked him, the harder he sang. The more tabloids caricatured him, the more flamboyantly he leaned into performance. His defiance became his shield, and his voice, that gravelly thunder, became the raw outlet for every cut, every loneliness, every loss. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Rod Stewart had achieved what few in music history could: hit records spanning continents, sold-out stadiums from Los Angeles to Tokyo, and a presence that etched him into pop culture itself. Few singers could boast of #1 singles across 6 consecutive decades. He was living proof that his voice wasn't just talent, it was a weapon of survival. But here's the cruel irony: the higher he climbed, the more fragile he became. Behind the sequins and stadium lights, Rod was still wrestling with wounds that no amount of applause could silence. And at the center of it all was a loss far older, far more personal than fame. A wound born not in the spotlight, but in his youth, when he made a choice that would haunt him for decades to come. Long before Rod Stewart became a household name, long before stadiums echoed with his roar, a quieter tragedy marked his life in a way that no success could ever erase. It was 1963, and Rod was just 18, a restless young man still chasing scraps of work and clinging to music as a last chance. At that fragile age, he became a father. His girlfriend at the time gave birth to a baby girl, Sarah. But with no career, no stability, and no real way to provide, Rod made the most devastating decision of his life. He allowed his daughter to be adopted. On paper, it might have seemed practical. He was broke, unsteady, and unable to support a child. But in his heart, it was nothing short of catastrophe. He later admitted bluntly, "It broke my heart. I didn't know who I was yet, let alone how to be a father." That confession is telling. Not an excuse, but a window into the torment of a young man caught between love and helplessness. For Sarah, adoption meant a chance at stability. For Rod, it meant living with a silence that would shadow every triumph to come. As his career took off in the late 1960s and exploded in the 1970s, the roar of fame could never drown the absence he carried. Every cheer from thousands was a reminder of the one voice missing. Every milestone, every award, Every sold-out show came paired with the quiet ache of knowing that somewhere his daughter was growing up without him. Fame magnifies everything, even guilt. The higher Rod soared, the deeper that hollow inside him grew. Sarah's side of the story carried its own weight. Raised by loving adoptive parents, she grew up in stability, but with an unspoken emptiness. She later admitted there was always a hidden longing, a question that lingered through her youth. Who am I really? Where do I come from? Sometimes she caught glimpses of Rod in magazines or on television, not as her father, but as a stranger adored by the world. Imagine the surreal pain of seeing your biological father celebrated across the globe, yet not knowing if you would ever stand before him as daughter instead of fan. For more than 4 decades, the silence remained unbroken. It wasn't until 2007, after both of Sarah's adoptive parents had passed away, that she reached out. By then, Rod was in his 60s, Sarah in her 40s, when they finally met. The moment was less about introduction than about collapse. The collapse of time, of absence, of decades lived apart. Rod described it with trembling honesty. I missed her whole life. That's something you don't get back. Sarah, for her part, explained it not as reconciliation but as recognition. Meeting him, she said, was like touching a missing part of herself she had been searching for all along. Their reunion didn't erase the sorrow. Nothing could. But it did bring a fragile healing, proof that even wounds left open for 40 years could be acknowledged, if not undone. The moment became one of the defining lessons of Rod's life. That fame cannot replace family, and that some absences will always sing louder than applause. Perhaps this is why so many of his songs resonate across generations, beneath the swagger and sequins. Listeners can hear something deeper, the tenderness of fragility, the gravel of regret. His music is not just entertainment, it is confession. In the rasp of his voice, you can hear the ache of a father who once let go of what he loved most. And maybe that's why his ballads still cling to listeners, because they carry the universal truth that the brightest lights often cast the darkest shadows. If Rod Stewart's career was a study in resilience, his personal life was a study in repetition. The same drive that made him unstoppable on stage often pulled him away from the people who needed him most at home. Success gave him riches, mansions, and the ability to live like royalty. But it also carved cracks into his family life. Cracks that widened into chasms, leaving behind regrets that no amount of applause could cover. The first turning point came in 1979 when Rod married actress Alana Hamilton to the world. It looked like a fairy tale, a rock icon at the peak of his fame and a Hollywood beauty, stepping into marriage with all the glitter of late 70s success. Soon came their 2 children, Kimberly and Sean, whose arrival seemed to promise redemption for a man still haunted by the loss of Sarah, the daughter he had given up in his youth. For a while, the photographs sparkled with glamour: leopard print jackets, couture gowns, Beverly Hills parties, poolside laughter. Rod appeared to have it all: fame, fortune, and now, a family of his own. But fame is never a silent house guest. It demands long tours, endless interviews, and the seduction of a lifestyle lived on the road, while Rod conquered stages worldwide. The intimacy of marriage with Alana began to erode. She, a celebrity in her own right, grew weary of the scrutiny and the constant absence. By 1984, the marriage was over. For Rod, it wasn't just divorce. It was the reopening of an old wound. He had once vowed no child of his would ever feel abandoned. That history would not repeat itself. Yet here he was again, standing in a courtroom as papers split his home apart. The consequences were profound. Kimberly grew up in the glare of celebrity culture, her childhood shadowed by tabloids. Sean stumbled through adulthood, battling addiction, arrests, and public struggles. For Rod, watching his son spiral was agony. He could handle critics. He could handle illness. But watching his own child fight demons, he couldn't conquer. That was a torment far sharper than any headline. Later, he admitted with weary honesty, "It's hard to hold it together when the whole world feels like it belongs to you, but your home doesn't." After Alana, Rod found companionship with model Kelly Emberg. Their relationship offered a quieter kind of stability. And in 1987, their daughter Ruby was born. Holding her, Rod spoke of redemption, of finally having a chance to be the steady father he had always longed to be. For a time, the photos told a gentler story, a mischievous grin softening into something more tender as he cradled his infant daughter. But again, the old patterns crept in. Tours, recording sessions, and the relentless demands of fame pulled him away. By 1989, the relationship unraveled. Ruby would later say she always knew her father loved her, but sometimes it felt like he belonged more to the world than to his family. The cycle repeated with devastating clarity in 1990 when Rod, then 45, married Rachel Hunter, a 21-year-old New Zealand supermodel. To Rod, it seemed like salvation, a chance to finally secure the permanence that had always eluded him. They had 2 children together, Renee and Liam, and for much of the decade, they appeared invincible. Glossy magazine spreads painted them as the perfect couple: Rod, the eternal rogue, and Rachel, the serene beauty grounding him. But beneath the surface, cracks widened. Their 25-year age gap, combined with Rod's relentless career and Rachel's desire to build her own identity, tore at the foundation. In 1999, Rachel walked away, leaving Rod stunned. "I thought she was the one forever," he confessed later. "I was wrong." This was perhaps the cruelest wound of all. With Alana, he had lost stability. With Kelly, he had lost companionship. But with Rachel, he lost faith itself. If even this marriage, the one he had believed in most, could collapse, then perhaps permanence was impossible. The heartbreak rippled outward. Renee was just 7, Liam only 5. Too young to understand why their parents no longer lived together. They grew up with the same fractures that had haunted Rod's earlier children. By the turn of the millennium, Rod Stewart had lived through multiple divorces, fractured families, and the kind of personal chaos that mirrored the unpredictability of his music career. To outsiders, the rock star's life looked indulgent and glamorous. To Rod, it was haunted by the silence of homes he couldn't keep together. Looking back, he has spoken about these years with remarkable candor. He doesn't paint himself as a victim, nor as a villain. Instead, he acknowledges the tension between fame and fatherhood, between the roar of stadiums and the whispers of bedtime stories. He admits he often failed, but he also insists those failures deepened him. They added fragility to the bravado, tenderness to the swagger. Perhaps this is why his voice resonates so powerfully, because woven into its rasp are the confessions of a man who has lost as much as he has gained. In the end, Rod Stewart's family story is one of paradox. The man adored across continents, who could command the voices of millions, often struggled to hear the smaller, quieter voices in his own home. It is a reminder that no matter how brightly the lights shine, they can never illuminate the shadows of guilt. By the 1990s, Rod Stewart seemed to have it all figured out. After years of fractured relationships and broken promises, his marriage to New Zealand's supermodel Rachel Hunter looked like the turning point. Rod, then 45, believed he had finally outrun the curse of impermanence. Rachel, just 21 when they wed in 1990, embodied youth, beauty, and grace the promise of a forever he thought he had been denied. Together they welcomed 2 children, Renee in 1992 and Liam in 1994. For much of the decade, the Stewart-Hunter family looked picture perfect. Magazine covers, Beverly Hills glamour, poolside smiles, 2 fans. It was the fairy tale of a rock icon finally grounded. But fairy tales have shadows. Beneath the glossy images, the age gap widened with time. Rod's relentless touring pulled him across oceans, while Rachel, barely into adulthood when they married, began to feel she had lost pieces of herself to life beside a global superstar. The world saw paradise. The couple lived with loneliness. In 1999, when Rachel walked away at just 30 years old, the news stunned not only fans but Rod himself. For all his earlier heartbreaks, nothing prepared him for this. He later admitted, "I thought she was the one forever. I was wrong." This wasn't just the collapse of another marriage. It was the breaking of an illusion. The belief that love could finally be permanent, that the ghosts of his past would stop haunting him with Rachel's departure. Rod didn't just lose a wife, he lost faith. For years afterward, friends described him as adrift, armored against intimacy, convinced that love was something he could no longer trust. The heartbreak was compounded by the children it left behind. Renee was 7, Liam only 5, too young to grasp why their parents no longer shared the same home. They grew up with the ache that all children of fractured families know, a sense that something safe had splintered. For Rod, this was the cruelest irony, cruelest. Despite all his vows to never repeat the pain of abandonment, he had once again passed it on. This chapter of Rod Stewart's life stands as a kind of emotional climax, not in the glory of fame, but in the fragility of love. With Rachel, he had truly believed permanence was possible. Her leaving hollowed him in ways even Sarah's absence had not, because this time he thought he had done everything right. The collapse forced him to confront the hardest truth, that success, wealth, and even devotion cannot always protect a heart from breaking. And yet, heartbreak carries strange gifts. Rachel's departure, devastating as it was, stripped Rod of illusions and forced him to reckon with himself. He stopped trying to perform permanence. He began to realize that love, if it came again, would not be about glamour or redemption, but about something quieter. Peace. That lesson would prepare him for the next chapter of his life, where, against all odds, he would finally find the stability he had been chasing for decades. When Rachel Hunter walked out of Rod Stewart's life in 1999, he was left shattered. At 54, with multiple marriages behind him, he began to wonder if love itself had abandoned him. For years, he drifted, keeping intimacy at arm's length, armored by the fear of being left again. And then, almost unexpectedly, came Penny Lancaster, not as a whirlwind of glamour or tabloid frenzy, but as something far more valuable: calm. Penny was different from the women who had come before. A model and trained photographer from Essex, she came from a working-class family, grounded in values that contrasted sharply with the turbulence of Rod's past. She wasn't dazzled by the rock and roll lifestyle. She wasn't trying to compete with his fame. She brought steadiness, patience, and a kind of warmth Rod had long been chasing without even realizing it. "She gives me peace," he would later say, a simple confession that carried the weight of decades of chaos. Their relationship unfolded slowly, away from the flashing cameras. Penny joined him on tours, not as a trophy, but as a partner, knowing instinctively when to stand beside him in the chaos and when to shield him from it. For the first time in years, Rod felt balance, the fragile but real sense that love didn't have to be fireworks. It could be sanctuary. In 2007, after nearly a decade together. Rod and Penny married in Italy. The ceremony wasn't a spectacle of Hollywood excess, but a quiet affirmation of gratitude. By then, Rod was 62, older, wiser, and softened by loss. This marriage wasn't about redemption or proving anything to the world. It was about learning to live with the past while still choosing love in the present. Together, they welcomed 2 sons, Alistair in 2005 and Aidan in 2011. Becoming a father again in his 60s carried its own paradox. On one hand, the laughter of his young boys filled him with awe, as though life had handed him one last, extraordinary chance. On the other hand, he knew he wouldn't walk beside them as long as he wanted. "It's the price you pay," he admitted, "to find love late in life." That bittersweet awareness made him cherish the ordinary. School runs, family dinners, goodnight kisses, unlike his earlier homes. This one endured. The endurance itself is what made Penny so significant in Rod's story. Where others drifted away, she remained. Where his past marriages cracked under the pressure of fame, Penny built stability brick by brick. Through the storms of health crises, aging, and the relentless grind of celebrity life, she anchored him in ways he had once thought impossible. With Penny, Rod didn't find perfection. He found presence. And for a man who had spent decades searching for permanence, that presence was the greatest gift. His marriage to Penny Lancaster stands not as a flashy chapter of rock and roll excess, but as the quiet redemption of a man who finally discovered that peace, not passion, was what he had been chasing all along, for decades. Rod Stewart seemed indestructible, bounding across stages, roaring into microphones, living as though the energy of youth would never fade. But in 2000, at the age of 55, his body betrayed him. A small lump led to tests, and the diagnosis hit like a hammer: thyroid cancer. For any patient, the word cancer is terrifying, but for Rod, the terror was doubled, because the disease threatened not just his life, but his very identity. His voice wasn't just a tool of his trade. It was the one constant that had carried him from London street corners to the world's biggest arenas. Without it, who was he? In interviews, he admitted the nights before surgery were abyssal. Lying awake, he whispered into the dark, "My voice, it's all I've ever had. Without it, who am I?" The surgery removed the cancer, but left devastation in its wake. When he awoke, the rasp and roar that had defined him for decades were gone. What remained was a broken whisper. Rod later described that moment as worse than death. The body had survived, but the soul had been cut out. In the weeks that followed, silence became his enemy. He would pick up a guitar, strum a chord, try to sing, and nothing came. The man who had once silenced stadiums now couldn't even hum a melody. Rehabilitation was grueling. He had to relearn how to sing, scale by scale, note by fragile note. Pride gave way to humiliation. The icon of Glastonbury now croaked through warm-ups like a beginner. He clenched his fists in rage, slammed doors, sometimes walked out of sessions. "I had to start again. Like a child learning to walk," he said, but slowly, painfully. The voice returned, changed, scarred, but alive. When he finally sang again, tears came not for the song itself, but for the miracle of sound, as if the trial weren't enough. In 2016, Rod faced a second battle: prostate cancer. By then, he was in his 70s. Still performing, still dazzling crowds, but privately carrying a secret that gnawed at him. For nearly 3 years, almost no one knew, not the headlines, not the fans. Only Penny and his children sensed shadows in his smile. He didn't want sympathy. He didn't want fear to color his family's days. So he fought quietly, enduring radiation and treatment in silence. The hardest part wasn't pain. It wasn't even the exhaustion. It was the fear of absence. At night, lying awake in dark hotel rooms, Rod didn't wonder about his career or his legacy. He wondered if he would live long enough to see his sons grow into men. Better dead than silent, he once admitted when recalling his thyroid battle, but with prostate cancer. The thought was harsher. Better anything than leaving my children fatherless. In 2019, when he finally revealed publicly that he had beaten the disease, the announcement wasn't delivered with rock star swagger. It was spoken with the trembling honesty of a survivor urging others to act. "I'm in the clear," he said, his voice cracking with relief, not just for himself, but as a plea for men to be tested, to not let silence kill them. These battles left scars far deeper than surgeries. Rod Stewart's voice was never quite the same. His body, rebuilt with steel knees and fused ankles, bore the toll of years of survival. But what these illnesses gave him was perspective. Each song performed after cancer wasn't just music. It was testimony. Every rasp carried defiance. Every chorus was a prayer. The man who had once feared silence now understood its power. And his survival made his voice more than entertainment. It became proof of endurance, a reminder that even legends bleed. And sometimes, even legends rise again. By the time Rod Stewart entered his late 70s, his career achievements were staggering. More than 250 million albums sold, 12 #1 albums, 11 chart-topping singles, and a knighthood from Queen Elizabeth II on paper. His life was the definition of triumph. His fortune, estimated around $300 million, seemed to confirm it. Homes in Beverly Hills and Essex, private jets, a garage of Ferraris and Lamborghinis, even the sale of his music catalog for a reported $100 million. All of it painted a picture of a man who had conquered not just music, but life itself. And yet, Rod was the first to admit, money cannot buy youth, nor can it buy time. The mansions couldn't silence the ache in his rebuilt knees. The cars sat idle, trophies of speed in garages while his body slowed. The yachts on the Riviera could not outrun the shadows of hospital nights. He once confessed that wealth sometimes made the loneliness louder. Castles only make the silence bigger. It was an admission that glitter fades quickly when weighed against absence. For decades, the tabloids portrayed Rod as the epitome of excess. Champagne, sequins, and women. But as he aged, he began to view those trappings differently. The cars, the palatial estates, the luxury, they were fleeting. What truly endured, he realized, were the voices around his dinner table, the laughter of children and grandchildren, and the steady presence of Penny Lancaster, who had given him the family stability he had chased for half a century. This perspective didn't come easily. It was forged in the crucible of illness, divorce, and loss. Watching his peers, fellow icons of the rock generation, pass away one by one forced Rod to confront his own mortality. When Ozzy Osbourne died in 2025, the news shook him not just as a loss of a friend, but as a mirror of his own fragility. "It's strange," he admitted softly, "to be one of the last still standing." Survival, once a badge of pride, now carried the loneliness of being left behind. And yet, legacy gave that survival meaning. The sale of his music catalog ensured that his voice would echo long after he was gone, not just in memories, but in the cultural fabric itself. But Rod's reflections on legacy weren't about contracts or numbers. In interviews, he hinted that his truest inheritance wasn't financial. It was his children, 8 of them. Across decades and relationships, they would inherit not just his fortune, but his lessons. that fame is hollow without family, that money is sweetest when shared, and that even legends are fragile. What good is a castle, he once mused, if there's no family in its halls? This paradox defines Rod Stewart's twilight years. He is both a monument of wealth and a man who has come to see its limits. He is both an icon celebrated by millions and a father who treasures the ordinary. School runs, family dinners, quiet mornings by the pool. The world sees the sequins in the spotlight. Rod sees time as the only true currency. Every sunrise feels like a gift. Every song like defiance. Every family moment like treasure. In the end, Rod Stewart's wealth is undeniable, but his greatest legacy is not the cars, the mansions, or even the platinum records. It is resilience, the ability to survive rejection, heartbreak, illness, and age, and still stand before the world with a voice that refuses to be silenced. Rod Stewart's story is not simply one of fame and fortune. It is the story of a boy who dreamed of football, who dug graves when that dream collapsed, who found survival in a guitar, and who built an empire of song from rejection and pain. It is the story of a man who soared to unimaginable heights, only to find that the summit can be lonelier than the climb. And it is the story of a survivor who, when illness threatened to take his voice, clawed it back one fragile note at a time. What makes his journey so powerful is not the perfection of his path, but the imperfection of it. Rod Stewart failed. He stumbled. He lost marriages, fractured families, and carried guilt that even sold-out stadiums could not drown. He battled cancer twice, stood at the edge of silence, and came face to face with mortality. Yet every time the world tried to erase him, he refused to go quietly. He turned sorrow into melody, regret into rasp, illness into testimony. That is why his music endures across generations. When we hear Maggie May or You're in My Heart, we don't just hear a catchy song. We hear the echo of heartbreak, the confession of a man who has lived and lost and somehow kept singing. We hear the proof that fragility and strength can coexist in the same voice. Rod's later years carry a paradox. On one hand, he is a man of wealth, luxury, and knighthood, a global icon who could retire in comfort. On the other hand, he is still on stage at nearly 80, joints rebuilt, lungs scarred, singing because silence feels too close to death. To leave the stage would be to leave life itself. Each performance is no longer just a concert, it is a defiant prayer, a reminder that he is still here, and that leaves us, the audience, with a question. Should Rod Stewart finally lay down the microphone, rest in the arms of family, and let the legacy he has built speak for itself? Or should he keep singing until the very last breath, refusing to surrender to silence? Perhaps there is no right answer. Perhaps the real lesson is not about retirement or endurance, but about what it means to live fully. Rod Stewart teaches us that life is not measured by the number of times we avoid heartbreak, illness, or failure, but by the number of times we rise again afterward. His resilience is his truest legacy. For fans, his story mirrors our own struggles in different keys. We may not sell out arenas, but we know the sting of rejection, the loneliness of fractured relationships, the fear of illness, the ache of time slipping away. And just as Rod kept singing, so too can we find ways to keep moving forward, to turn our pain into testimony. So when you hear his voice, that gravelly thunder softened by years, scarred but unbroken, listen closely. Behind every rasp is not just music, but a survival song, a reminder that legends bleed, but they also endure, a reminder that even when the world tries to silence us, there is still power in refusing to go quietly. Rod Stewart's life may be nearing its twilight, but his song is not finished. And maybe that is the greatest gift he leaves us, the courage to keep singing, no matter how fragile the voice, until the very end.